that leadership continues to be defined in very hierarchical and patriarchal ways that does not necessarily reflect the ways that Black, Indigenous, young women, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse folks are interacting with our communities and are creating change, whether it be at the policy or national level, or whether it be at the community and local level. Because again, the ways that we lead, the ways that we create change in our communities are often not recognized within colonial and hierarchical power structures. So in order for us to be able to really create leadership and possibilities for structural and systemic reform within the systems that we interact with on a daily basis, I believe that we need to be taking a whole new approach, not only leadership development among young women and girls and gender diverse youth, but also dismantling some of the systems and some of the kind of deep-rooted structures within our civic spaces and leadership spaces that continue to impede on our ability to meaningfully engage with policy and decision-making and civic processes. So this talk is going to be very informal. It's going to kind of be very interactive, and I've left much room at the end for us to kind of discuss potentially some of the points that I will bring up. But I've kind of divided everything into 4 subgroups. One of them is our aspirations as feminist leaders, as leaders who want liberation. The second one is challenging current leadership development models, which we already talked about, and redefining leadership. And finally, embracing the possibilities for transforming and redefining leadership. So I believe that our aspirations as feminists, as folks who've been within feminist or leadership spaces for a while, can kind of be categorized into these 4 different groups that are kind of connected to each other, right? To our conversations at Young Women's Leadership Network and work with organizations like Girls Action Foundation or different coalitions of feminist leaders, we've really realized that what we're really fighting for and what our aspirations are as a feminist movement have all to do with liberation and redistribution of power and transformation when it comes to civic spaces. And the first one of those aspirations is really honing in that whole idea of anti-oppression and intersectionality, because we know that feminism is not enough. Mainstream feminism that has the gender first approach, it's been working perfectly or kind of well for white women. We can see issues like two issues like the gender wage gap that, for example, it's been kind of decreasing for white women very slowly but steadily, and it's been moving forward. But we know that for women with disabilities, for Black women, for Indigenous women, the gaps have been widening in the past few years. So we know that in order for us to really be able to move society and move these systemic structures forward in ways that actually benefit marginalized women, we can't just talk about feminism as a single issue movement, but we need to make sure that we're applying anti-oppression and intersectional lenses into understanding where the root causes of the problems are and how we can intervene to address them. And again, recognizing that intersectionality is a framework. It is not an identity. I think within current feminist movements or within current political structures, a lot of times it is assumed that a person can be intersectional, but what they really mean is that that person is diverse. And by that we mean that that person holds various or multiple marginalized identities all at once. And that, you know, that's kind of assumed that like a person can be intersectional, whereas intersectionality is the framework within which we can understand that person's kind of multiple identities, how they go around, you know, they go about their lives in the world and how they're interacting with different systems of oppression. And again, the same goes with anti-oppression, right? It is just not a theory. It is not something that's easily understood as a noun or as an identity, you know, unless it's put into practice. Anti-oppression, you can't say as an organization or as a leader that you're anti-oppressive when your work, when the systems that you're creating, when the ways you're interacting with other communities does not necessarily recognize the systems of oppression that they have to interact with on a day-to-day basis, and that you're not creating accessible ways for them to engage in your work. So again, saying an anti-oppressive feminist has sometimes again, it's like the buzzwords, right? We say intersectional, we say anti-oppressive, but our work doesn't really recognize that. So again, making sure that we aspire as feminists to be able to practice anti-oppression, to be able to use feminist, intersectional feminist frameworks to recognize where our problems lie and how we can address them. The second one is yeah. Am I talking too fast?
No, we have, is it
Yeah.
possible to zoom in on your presentation or have a larger?
Is it too small?
Yes.
Okay. Does this work?
Does that look good? Folks in the chat, is that better? Yes, much better. Okay.
All right, thank you for telling me. I think one of our other aspirations as feminist leaders is to really understand leadership in a transformative way, to achieve transformative leadership, to bring about transformative leadership in ways that take us from individuals into a collective that can utilize our power and privilege to make change. I think a lot of times it is assumed that you know, once you are a feminist and once you have an agenda, you can individually move forward and support a movement, whereas we believe that as transformative leadership really requires us to have that feminist awakening on our own, to do unlearning work, to do solidarity work, but to really stand in solidarity and as a collective when it comes to supporting multiple feminist agendas and multiple liberation agendas at the same time. Because again, assuming that there is one feminist movement, it really continues to erase the different movements for liberation that have existed within Black communities, within Indigenous communities, and outside of this Western feminist idea for centuries. So again, having that feminist awakening requires us to understand how we can utilize our individual power to support a collective movement toward liberation for everyone. It also kind of talks about redefining power, and by that, we're really trying to pay an ode to the fact that power has been used as a tool for domination against communities of color, marginalized communities for centuries. So a lot of us have kind of uneasy relationships with power, where we associated with this dominant narrative, with hierarchies, with the patriarchy, and with colonialism and racial hierarchies, whereas transformative leadership is really committed to understanding how we can use power, collective power, as a resource to bring about positive change for the communities that we interact with. To understand power in a non-hierarchical way, to understand power in a transactional form that can kind of be passed around and shared within communities to move an agenda forward in ways that in ways that don't reproduce hierarchies and oppression. And again, it kind of feeds into that utilizing our privileges instead of, you know, sitting down. And I think this is more of a conversation to have with folks with privilege. But I think understanding how allies and white people, specifically when we're talking about racial liberation, for example, can utilize their privilege to do things and to access spaces or to lend power to folks who can't usually access those spaces, is one of our aspirations. And then the next one is really liberation, because I think a lot of times in the feminist movement and in women's movements, when we're talking about liberation and inclusivity, what we really mean is equality. And the problem with equality is that you need a default. You always need something else to measure yourself up to when we're talking about equality. So we fall into these binary ideas of like, you know, women should be equal to men, and like we should achieve equality. And I think these boundaries and these binaries of gender and power continue to reproduce the same existing structures that have been harming trans folks, non-binary folks, gender diverse folks for so long. And by liberation, what we really mean is come as who you are and exist as who you are, and be and really have and really be able to give access to everyone in order to have a say, in order to be able to direct agendas and introduce agendas and be a part of a collective without necessarily reproducing those same old ideas of like power and equality. And again, I think that's that's been really harmful, especially when it comes to like feminist leadership and women's leadership in the past, again, because it assumes that I think that whole conversation around parity, it assumes that as soon as we have 50-50 parliament, as soon as 50% women are in parliament, all of our problems are going to be solved. And again, that's what's wrong with these binaries, because they're not really focused on liberation and motive and politics. They're more focused on the optics of equality. And in white feminist movements, that's been very harmful. And again, in liberation, when we're talking about liberatory leadership, for example, we are talking about moving beyond function, right? Because you can't be. And what we mean by that is that a title and a role does not necessarily define a leader. You can be an executive director, you can be a leader of an organization, but not necessarily be a good leader, not necessarily know how to move an agenda forward. And that's what we mean by moving beyond functions. Because as a manager, as an executive director, you may be perfect at managing a budget, at leading an organization, at teamwork. But again, management is different from leadership, and that's what we're really trying to hone in when we talk about liberatory leadership and liberation. I'm kind of going around in circles, but I'm going to be talking about this in later slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And then we really want to I think at the final stage of having access, anti-oppressive and intersectional leadership and transformative leadership, and finally liberation, I feel like for us at the end of this tunnel is an idea of collective power, of solidarity, of making sure that we understand where structural and systemic changes need to be made, and really stand in solidarity with different movements in different ways in order to be able to kind of achieve that. And again, I'm sorry, can you still read this, or is this too small? I think you should be good. All right. So, and I think one of the like perks of achieving collective power, hopefully at the end of this long journey that we're all on, is accountability. Because I think I would like the feminist movement and feminist leadership structures to get us to a point where accountability is a given within any system and structure. Because when there's equal distribution of power, when we're really thinking in liberatory terms, and we're thinking about unlearning and moving forward together, then accountability becomes an integral part of that. Currently, accountability is seen as a punitive measure. It's mostly about getting rid of the abuser or getting rid of the perpetrator without necessarily looking at transformative justice or transformative ways of looking at internal and systemic structures. But again, within a collective power and liberatory leadership model, we can see that kind of this whole idea of solidarity that feeds into structural and systemic change can really get us to a place where we can uphold accountability as a main pillar of feminist leadership. So let's kind of talk about some of the ways in which the current leadership development models have really failed Black, Indigenous, and racialized and marginalized young women and girls. And I titled this "Pussy Hat Leadership Has Failed Us," and by that what we really mean is white feminism. This whole mainstream liberal white feminist idea that really encourages respectability politics, that's really focused on the numbers and that whole idea of parity, but that doesn't necessarily take into consideration the real life experiences of Black and marginalized leaders when accessing leadership positions. So again, I have a whole problem with representation as one of the driving factors of feminist leadership or gender equality movements when it comes to political participation. And I believe that no representation is better than bad representation. We know that there's been a lot of focus on this whole idea of representation matters for a long time. or for as long as I've been around when it comes to feminist leadership. But we know that, for example, when we're talking about liberation, when we're talking about, let's say, an issue like bodily autonomy and abortion access and reproductive rights, obviously there are women who do not necessarily believe in that. Obviously there are women who don't understand the ways in which kind of reproductive violence has been enacted upon like Black and Indigenous communities in North America and in Canada, for example. So it is not, it goes back to that whole conversation of like a 50-50 parliament is not necessarily going to liberate us. It is liberatory leaders, it is feminist leaders and inclusive intersectional leaders who are going to do that. So again, it doesn't necessarily lead to any action or transformation, and we must be very aware of that, because it makes up a nice hashtag. It makes us feel good, because obviously who doesn't want to see a badass Black woman like on the, you know, on the cover of Times. But when it comes to really structural and systemic actions, representation kind of fails to get us there. And again, we won't settle for scraps, right? It doesn't matter if, you know, one of us making it, it doesn't mean that we're all making it. And it's not until we've actually made systemic changes that allow us all to meaningfully engage with social and civic systems that we can really achieve meaningful representation that actually benefits our communities. Another conversation that we've been having when it comes to feminist leadership is this whole idea of climbing the ladder, right? We see this conversation a lot of times in the private sector, in the corporate sector, with conversations around women in like C-suite roles. But again, that, you know, at what cost? Like, what cost does this representation come from? And I think that's been really, sorry, I'm just trying to, I have a notification. Really talking about the cost of that, right? Because if we're talking about a ladder, if we're talking about reproducing hierarchical systems of power that really require us to climb something or to get to the top, we need to recognize that for people to be at the top, there are people who need to be at the bottom. Right? So that's how hierarchies work inherently. And that I don't feel like that as feminist leaders, that is a model of leadership that we want to be reproducing. So this whole mainstream feminist idea of kind of climbing the ladder it's actually been putting us one step forward and 10 steps back, because, you know, one of us makes it, but by kind of it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you know, a lot of times someone may be the first Black Muslim person to have this role, or the first Asian person to hold this role, and it's really amazing. It's a double-edged sword. You know, you are there, and it's really a cause for celebration. But at the same time, through having kind of validating that system by participating in it, we've kind of enforced its validity like tenfold. So again, that's a problem. And again, this whole idea of like clean cut diversity, right? It's really unsettling for a lot of folks, and especially me, mainly because again, it's defined by the limitations that are set out by hierarchical and kind of white supremacist institutions, right? When we're talking about diversity, a lot of times it's like, oh, we have our Muslim person and we have our Indigenous person and that's it. But that we know that, you know, there's no one way to be Indigenous, there's no one way to be Muslim, and there's no way that one Indigenous or Muslim person can suddenly come in and represent their whole community and to help institutions address the problems or the relationships that they need to be making with those communities. So and I think that's been especially harmful because it's told a lot of racialized people, a lot of marginalized women, that unless you self-tokenize, unless you sell a part of your identity as a qualification, you will not be able to access these roles, right? And obviously it doesn't mean that the folks who access those type of jobs or those type of roles are not qualified for the job and that they're not there based on their merit. But more often than not, we see people talking about it's like, I am like a Muslim engineer, I'm a hijabi engineer, while we know that that does not necessarily play a role into how well they may be able to perform a job, while while recognizing that, of course, they're going to bring a whole new set of understandings and experiences when it comes to designing and working with marginalized communities. And it's kind of made us into like these disposable bodies, because if you are just like a hijabi engineer, I can go down the street and like find 10 hijabi engineers at Ryerson and just replace you with any of them, right? And I think that's what's been proven in a lot of situations, especially when it comes to marginalized women in politics. We see that, the same thing that happened with like Jody Wilson-Raybould or Selena Cesar Chavon, like amazing racialized women who really did great work in terms of kind of the anti-racism strategy and reforming the justice system in ways that are responsive to the realities of Black and Indigenous folks. But the moment they start talking about kind of what they really need from systemic structures, the systems and the structures that they're engaging with, they suddenly become disposable. But it's because they've always been disposable, and our civic systems have not necessarily always been truly inclusive to their ideas and their experiences beyond what's been constituted as like diversity as defined by that institution. I'm not sure if this is confusing, but we can always come back to it. And some of the examples of that look like this, right? I love Shirley Chisholm, obviously, but I think this quote has been taken out of context so many times, and it's been turned into kind of a conversation that does not necessarily move us forward at this day and age and this moment that we are when it comes to demanding more from our leaders and from civic institutions. So it reads that if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Of course, it's amazing. We don't need anybody's permission to engage with conversations and decision-making systems that continue to impact our lives. But how it's currently being used is, I don't think it's very liberatory, in the sense that it still insists that we want to be at the same table as all of these people, whereas I think the liberatory movement and intersectional feminist movement would not even give, of course it would engage with systems of power that continue to to impact our lives, but at the same time you want to look at different ways of building power, to be able to kind of dismantle that power from the outside, because we know that there are so many limitations, there are so many different ways that these structures and these systems continue to reproduce anti-Blackness and colonialism and misogyny, that unless we're able to offer something alternative in return, we are not going to be able to kind of dismantle that. So it's really a conversation around how far are we able to move, and how deeply are we able to change these oppressive structures until we decide to say, enough is enough, we're doing our own thing. And that's one example. And again, that whole like Add Women Change Politics campaign that the Liberals had, where it was really just, and again, these conversations, they reproduce systemic sexism, mainly. Again, it's a very essentialist feminist notion that women we're inherently kinder, we're inherently nicer, we're inherently collaborative, and again, that is a very sexist idea, because it's connecting socialized behaviors to our sex and to our gender identity, which is not necessarily true. So again, understanding how all of these systems of power are using kind of sexism and imbalanced power dynamics to kind of infiltrate like feminist leadership movements to make it work for them is very important when we're talking about redefining leadership. And beyond the structural and the more cultural pieces to defining leadership, there are actual tangible ways that leadership development organizations and civic movements have been failing young women when it comes to young women and gender diverse folks, when it comes to redefining leadership. Again, we've been focusing too much on leadership and civic engagement education. We haven't been focusing enough on capacity building and accessibility. We've been reproducing hierarchies and upholding the patriarchy, again, through binary and sexist ideas. And we've been rewarding compliance and assimilation through that whole idea of like tokenism and respectability politics. And I'm going to explain those a bit more. So by focus on education, I mean that there are so many different campaign schools, there are so many different leadership programs for young women and trans folks to make sure that they can access leadership spaces. But through our conversations with our participants and with younger women, millennial women who ran for office, we've actually found out that there's actually a problem when it comes to leadership and civic leadership development. And that's that it assumes that a lack of knowledge and expertise is the main barrier for young women leaders when it comes to engage with civic structures, right? It assumes that we don't know how politics works, we don't know how political structures work, and once we know how it works, all of our problems, all of our barriers are going to kind of magically fade away, and we're going to be able to run for office or to take on leadership roles. And so it neglects to address systemic and structural barriers that impede on our ability to reach our full potential. And it reproduces existing power dynamics and leadership models, right? Because more often than not, a lot of leadership spaces, leadership programs and campaign schools, they networking is something that is shared with, throughout all of these programs, right? It's like how you talk to white people to make sure that they hear you. It's like you always shake hands with like your right hand, and like it's really it's a really uneasy and unsettling kind of form of leadership that's reproduced through these leadership structures that is really preparing young women to fit into existing hierarchical structures, right? It doesn't build new power. It doesn't offer alternative ways or alternative ways for leadership, and doesn't necessarily amplify the ways that we're already leading in our communities. So it's always trying to kind of fit us into these different molds of what leadership looks like. And the second one, of course, was the lack of capacity building and capacity. Again, by just focusing on education and assuming that a lack of knowledge is what's holding us back, we fail to recognize the economic problems, the accessibility problems, all of these different issues that continue to impede on young women's ability to engage with leadership and civic institutions. And an example of that is, let's talk about like an older daughter of immigrants who's working full-time to support her family, and her family depends on her to make ends meet, to pay rent, to send money back home. Is this girl going to be able to kind of take 3 months off her job, 2 months off her job in order to be able to kind of run for office and campaign for a full month? Right? When we, in a country where we don't have a minimum basic income. Is a mother of 2 children in a single household, or even a double income household, going to be able to run for office knowing that the very livelihood of her family depends on her income? So really understanding how things like structural changes and systemic changes, like a minimum basic income, how far that can go in terms of supporting young women and marginalized leaders in order to run for office. I think that those are kind of some of the conversations that we need to be having more, in addition to that kind of education work that we continue to do. And I think, again, when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about the cost of leadership, right? We were talking to a millennial candidate in Ottawa who was telling us that it took, she had to make a decision between having lunch or being able to pay for public transit to get to the riding where she had to campaign, right? So understanding how our systemic structures and how our electoral systems are set up in ways that marginalize and kind of remove marginalized communities from these spaces is also very important. And of course, when it comes to kind of engaging like Black or Indigenous folks, and again, sometimes refugees within political structures that are the very reason for their oppression. I think that is a conversation we should be having, right? Like we assume that, we're gonna open this like leadership education program and assume that of course like Indigenous women are going to want to do it, but without necessarily understanding that there are so many conversations we need to have about leadership and like civic engagement on this land before we can even get to a place where we can talk about engaging with kind of colonial structures. The other one is reproducing hierarchies. So our definitions of leadership continue to follow masculine and hierarchical patterns. We want someone who's strong. We want someone who can stand at the front of the room and lead a group. We want someone that can potentially stand up to the bullies in Parliament and at Queen's Park. And so we often don't talk about someone who is empathetic, who's someone who understands community, someone who has lived experience. So the way we define leaders and the way we view leaders has been completely skewed by this whole patriarchal and hierarchical notion of leadership that's been sold to us, and it continues to marginalize a lot of people. And even then, when women continue to enter these spaces, they face sexist double standards and violence while reproducing kind of this same leadership models a lot of times. And by that, kind of that whole example of like Hillary versus AOC, we know that they're both two women who are engaging with civic institutions. And through the last election, we saw how sexism really came into play when it came down to the vote and the media portrayal of Hillary Clinton. But at the same time, again, Hillary's style of leadership, she's a known imperialist in the Middle East to people like me who come from Iran. She is someone who is very masculine presenting. She is someone who continues to face sexist attacks while being masculine presenting and literally doing everything to uphold the patriarchy. And then we have someone like AOC, who is a marginalized woman, who is also like Hillary was getting attacked for like being a tomboyish, and like people were calling her like a lesbo and all of these different slurs. And then we have someone like AOC, who a lot of times embraces her femininity and like wears bold lipstick, and like had a video of her like dancing come out, who is like this whole like playful feminine young woman. And at the same time, we see her getting attacked for the same things that were literally opposite to what Hillary was doing. So kind of it's a double-edged sword, kind of being a woman in leadership and being a woman in politics, because again, you are in these institutions, you are interacting with them, but there's no right way to lead within these spaces as long as you're a woman. And again, these conversations are even reproducing hierarchies mainly because our values, the ways we talk about equality and equity in politics, completely, like, they leave no trace of gender diverse and non-binary people. And the problem with that is that, again, when we talk about 50-50, when we talk about gender parity, we completely neglect like a part of our community, a part of our electorate that continues to exist and have no voice in parliament. Again, through those like inaccessible and low capacity ways of civic engagement that we've created. And I'm just trying to be conscious of the time. That's why I'm going fast a bit. But again, and another problem we have is like rewarding assimilation, right? Like rewarding this whole idea of like being a model minority and subscribing to respectability politics. And respectability politics are basically rules for marginalized people to follow in order to earn respect in mainstream culture, right? So when we're talking about, let's say, like Black women in politics, it's like she's Black, but she's not too Black. Right, like she's, this person, she's indigenous, but like she doesn't like demand that we like make smudging like possible for her in every single room. So it really gives racialized people conditions for existing within spaces that we've been historically excluded from, and as a result, it rewards assimilation. So a lot of times, again, like if it's okay if you're Muslim, but as long as, you don't have to bring up racism and like Islamophobia in every conversation, we're going to be fine with that. So it really limits how we can interact with civic institutions. It limits how much change we can make. And again, that's the problem with it, right? It's not liberatory. It goes back into that whole idea of representation. As long as your body is here and it's like window dressing for our diversity cause, we're good with it. But again, liberation and transformation within institutions that reward assimilation is never going to be possible. So from that, now we're at a point where we know where the problems are as racialized women. I mean, we can kind of see and we live through all of these problems. But when it comes to redefining leadership and having liberatory and transformative leadership, I feel like these are 5 kind of pillars that I try to focus on in my work. And again, these have been conversations that we've had with our participants, and they continue to be shared among a lot of like progressive and like feminist marginalized women in leadership. And the first one, I'm going to kind of go through them as I explain them. The first one is kind of building collective power in order to redefine leadership. We know that as individuals, we can transform ourselves to use our power, resources, and skills in non-oppressive and inclusive structures and processes that mobilize others to build collective power. We all have privilege. We all have spaces where we know our voices are going to be heard. So by building collective power and really focusing on how we can utilize our privilege and our access to these spaces to support each other's agendas, we can't really get to a place where different movements can coexist and interact and move toward liberation. And one of the ways that feminist leaders or young women within different organizations have been doing that is by building coalitions to support multiple feminist and liberatory agendas. Because again, we don't need one shared agenda to build solidarity and power. And I think one of the ways that mainstream feminism and leadership development has really failed us is this whole idea of like having one shared feminist agenda for all women. And we know that when we talk about all women, we're leaving a whole bunch of people behind. And so I think the first rule of building collective power should be recognizing that we all belong to different movements. We are all fighting against different systems of oppression that do inherently have similar root causes, but that our liberation and our agendas are always not going to be the same. And once we realize that, then we can start building coalitions and supporting each other in solidarity, instead of, again, just having like this huge fight to kind of figure out this one thing that we all agree on. The second way is really just meaningful inclusion that leads to increased innovation by permitting all voices to kind of come forward and be be creative, to come up with new solutions and agendas that encompass a whole, variety of problems. So I think that's what a lot of companies and spaces are getting wrong about inclusion. Like, inclusion is a practice. It is something that needs to be enacted and put into action at like every single level of the work that we do. And unless we're doing that, we're not actually supporting inclusion and meaningful innovation. We know that when people are able to kind of bring their whole selves to the table and have meaningful conversations around what's bothering them, where the issues are in their communities, and where the gaps lie in services, that's really when we can actually move forward and solve problems, and not necessarily when they're getting used as tokens and as window dressing. So making sure that we're co-designing spaces, we're collaborating with different communities to understand where their issues lie and how we can best utilize our privilege to support them is the best way to move forward when it comes to creating feminist and liberatory leadership. And again, to like creating an agenda for liberation, I think we know that we said that our agendas should not necessarily all be the same, that we can kind of support different agendas and different movements at the same time. But really, to achieve liberation, we need to set the ground rules for what feminist leadership is going to look like in the future, right? 100 years ago, when the first women's movements were kind of achieving their first form of success. They were able to do that. The white feminists were able to get the right to vote because Black women were taking care of their children, because Black women were cleaning their houses, right? But moving forward, we can't do the same. We can't really allow the Black, Indigenous, and racialized women who are working precariously, who are really just essential workers, who are basically making our world go around, behind when it comes to creating our liberation agenda. We're done with that, right? So we need to prioritize anti-oppression. We need to, I think one of those anti-oppressions should be anti-racism and gender liberation when it comes to creating this whole agenda. And by gender liberation, we really mean just complete betrayal of the binary and gender roles as we know them within like a mainstream Western society. Because again, if we're going to be truly trans-inclusive and liberatory, we need to find ways to understand and to engage with different gender identities and different ideas of womanhood, of manhood, of being non-binary, of being trans, in order to really be able to set an agenda for liberation. And we need to remove engagement barriers for diverse young women and gender diverse youth. And that can include advocating for better and like more collective forms of organizing, of whether it be like in social justice movements, whether it be in organizations, whether it be in political actions. Or it can look like collective advocacy for ways to kind of redistribute not only power, but also wealth in ways that allow everyone to participate in meaningful ways without necessarily neglecting their most basic needs of being able to kind of afford food and shelter and healthcare. And again, I think the idea of like a minimum basic income, it's been something that since the pandemic started, it's been going around, and even before that, but I think this pandemic has really amplified how it can be helpful in terms of sustaining our communities in meaningful ways at times of need. And again, kind of following up with that whole idea of gender liberation, really calling out binarism and sexism in leadership development spaces. And the last point, I think it's the second to last point, it's the whole idea of like safety first. We feel, I think one of the ways that feminist movements and social justice movements have been failing marginalized youth and women and gender diverse folks is that whole idea that like feminist spaces or progressive spaces can't be violent. So whether it be like, racial stereotyping and microaggressions or sexual violence, it's always assumed that, oh, that doesn't happen here. Oh, we're all feminists, so we're all inherently like probably not racist. And that's been causing a lot of harm within spaces. That's how our agendas and that's how our movements have not been able to create solidarity and work in collaboration. It's mainly because mainstream feminism and mainstream cultures are really not open to unlearning, to learning, and to accountability. So making sure that we understand that power dynamics exist within all structures and within all systems, and that we need to prioritize safety and support networks for the most marginalized members of our community. I think that's one of the biggest things that liberatory leadership can offer us. And again, that's something that the Young Women's Leadership Network has been doing, for example. So we know that, making sure that young women can access civic spaces is a huge task that we've taken on, but we also understand that sexual violence is a main barrier to a lot of folks' ability to engage with political institutions. So we don't just build capacity for leadership, but we also work with institutions and with political movements to kind of address that sexual violence. So it has to go both ways. And the final part is the piece about accountability, which really encourages us to create ecosystems and team structures that encourage unlearning and kind of transforming. And by that, we really, when we're talking about like liberatory leadership or transformative leadership, we're really talking about creating spaces where the cause that people harm can be recognized, and that can encourage and inspire spaces to address deep cultures and deep structures that made room for that kind of violence in the first place. a lot of times our anti-harassment or anti-racism policies are very reactive. They wait for kind of an incident to happen, and then they're very punitive. So they really rely on removing the perpetrator or holding the perpetrator to account. So that kind of takes away from this whole idea of like institutional accountability and understanding the culture within which those forms of violence were permissible. And what we really mean by accountability within the liberation framework is to really create spaces where, again, we talked about the safety of the folks facing that form of violence, and now we need to talk about like institutional accountability. And this is specifically important when we're talking about marginalized women, because we know that I'm talking from experience that like racialized men, they're given a dozen chances when it comes to kind of perpetrating violence or perpetrating racism under the guise of like, we need to build our men up, right? And we hear that all the time. We need to like build our men up. Our men already face so much violence, but we forget to kind of mention that this comes at the cost of like our women continuing to face violence. And we know that kind of those chances are not given to Black women. Those chances are not given to brown women. Those chances are not given to Indigenous women. And I don't want to say like problematic, but let's say like the first mean thing that you say, or the first kind of wrong move that you make becomes the last one, because you're asked to leave the space. You're often called violent. And it doesn't necessarily read into an accountability or a transformative conversation where that person can learn from their behavior and really move toward a culture where again, we're all learning together and really like moving toward liberation as a community. And again, this whole idea of accountability, it has a very gendered, effect where it's, the men and the like masculine folks are often not held accountable, and then the women, whether you're the victim or the perpetrator, it is the like women and femme folks who have to pay for it a lot of times. So I know we talked about what's wrong with our leadership structures or leadership development models, and we talked about what the types of things that can happen in order for us to really create feminist, liberatory and inclusive feminist leadership models. But I'm not going to be able to kind of leave you folks with a few examples of possibilities or what we can do to kind of achieve those, mainly because I feel like a lot of the things that we talked about, they are learned behaviors. There are notions that, like feminism, we need to come to like an awakening and an understanding of how we interact with the systems and with these behaviors on a personal level. But really, when we're talking about like imagining the possibilities for for reaching liberation and for supporting our communities in ways that don't reproduce hierarchical power, we're really talking about a system and a space that encourages innovation over assimilation, right? We know that we can't innovate within a space that demands assimilation, that really tries to integrate everyone under the same umbrella. We know that as marginalized people, we know where the solutions lie, we know where the gaps lie, and we're the best people to innovate and to provide solutions for where these possibilities can be found. We need to prioritize collective power. We know like the idea of collective power, it is so new within a lot of like feminist spaces, but we know that none of the achievements that we've had in the past few years have been kind of reached, without kind of building collective power among voters, among people who've been demanding change for a long time. And I know that a lot of those changes have been reversed, but even when we're talking about that whole We Believe Survivors movement in 2014, it was really the collective power of like survivors within Indigenous communities, within racialized communities, within queer communities who had really been kind of brought to action through this whole movement, and that led to a social awakening and the beginning of a lot of social changes at workplaces. I mean, they're not perfect, but again, I think the whole idea of building collective power should be at the forefront, mainly because I think our problem, even within feminism, is really centering individuals in conversations about power and leadership. But we know that like individuals can only go so far. And this whole idea of systemic change, I think we don't want interpersonal change. We don't want social change within a small group of people. We want systemic change that really allows us to dismantle all of those different structures at different levels when it comes to kind of liberation. You know, we know interpersonal racism is a thing. We know individual biases and individual racism are a thing. And they all continue to uphold this systemic structures that continue to allow for institutions and for communities to really enact anti-Blackness and racism in very violent ways. But once we have innovated and once we have figured out where our problems lie and where our solutions are, and we've built the collective power, we can really lead our communities to systemic change and to work to dismantle these systems of oppression instead of just trying to kind of do damage control and harm reduction. And I think the number one thing that can really underline all of these possibilities is the whole idea of solidarity. Again, our movements don't have to be shared, our agendas don't have to be shared in order for us to understand the struggle, in order for us to really focus on building systemic power and collective power in ways that move us all forward together. I know I've been rambling a bit. I don't have the most fast forward kind of train of thought, so I'm open to kind of answer any questions that you folks may have around any of these notions and ideas. But yeah, I've had so much fun kind of like reflecting on my own journey, whether it be with Girls Action or my leadership journey in general while creating this presentation. So I hope it was helpful. I know I talk too fast and I ramble sometimes, but yeah, thank you so much for listening to me and joining us.
Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, I think if you have time, there were some questions that came through the chat, but I want to give folks an opportunity to unmute themselves and, let us hear your voice. So let's see. Okay, I believe that everyone has the hand raising option, and please let me know in the chat if you cannot see that. Okay, does anyone want to ask a question or make a comment? Oh, yes. Michelle, I think you're unmuted, so go ahead and let us know.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Arezoo. How do you say your name? Sorry?
It's Arezoo.
Arezoo. Am I saying it okay?
Yeah,
okay.
It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, please give me that. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate. Great information. Thank you so much for all of that. So I do a lot of the work in this specific area. Like I work with the Ontario Council of International Corporation.
Yeah.
I'm involved. And I wanted to specifically talk about when you talk about the opportunities and things, like how do we work together when there is like a geographical gap, there's still like a lack of technology, which is very loaded, I know.
Yeah.
And in order to like address those issues, like what are some accountability kind of co-creation that can work? And I'm also from Markham, by the way, and I'm living in Markham.
We should hang out.
Together
after social distancing.
To work together on this issue, because I would really like to know, and I've been asking many people, like it's not like an obligation. I know it's a loaded question, but if you have any insights on like how can we move like all of us to the digital platform, because if the digital platform is what we're using, then what are some ways that we can really like work together on those? And I would really like to know. Yeah. That's my first question. question.
So I'm going to kind of rephrase your question just to make sure that I understood it correctly. So you're saying, how do we move toward building kind of collaboration and accountability when there's geographical distance, and that when we're all working online and digitally, right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that whole idea of like access to technology, of course, it is a huge barrier. So, I think it's been amplified by this whole idea of social distancing, right? Like everyone was hashtagging work from home and like WFH, but we knew that like the people's access to kind of a safe working space and technology is not equal. So that's caused a lot of problems for folks. Kind of like across the country. But I think like our approaches to understanding where our values lie and what kind of movements we want to be, I'm not sure if technology has really impacted that. I think we're moving conversations online, and I think obviously face-to-face contact and empathy it can't be replaced by anything. But I think when it comes to building accountability, it's really through defining what your baseline is, what your non-negotiables are, and really working from there is really important. Again, because with Young Women's Leadership Network, we say we aspire to be anti-oppressive, we aspire to be trans-inclusive, we aspire to be intersectional in our approach, and we have our own definitions of what that looks like, and these are definitions that we created and that we've tested with our participants, with our advisory council members, with organizations that we work with. And once we were really very adamant about these are organizations that we're going to work with, and these are organizations that, because they display certain types of behaviors, we're not going to work with, we're never going to interact with, and we know that their agenda is never going to kind of even meet the most basic needs of the participants that we're engaging in our work. And really that became our ground for kind of accountability and collaboration within like feminist movements and within coalitions, right? So I think really with whatever team it is that you're working, whatever coalition it is that you're building, I would encourage that you all have real conversations around where your values are and what type of leadership or agenda you're trying to move forward. And again, as I mentioned in one of the slides, right, we know that we're not all going to have a shared agenda, but for liberation there are specific criteria that need to be met, like again, intersectionality and anti-oppression, and I think figuring that out within your team is what I would encourage you to do. Was that helpful? I'm not sure.
I just want to know, like, is it a group phone call? Because I don't know who's interested, and that's one of the biggest things, is that we have people who are interested, who are in the field, who are like, academias or whatever, but a lot of times there are people who are interested or who lack the experience or whatever, but they have those like perspectives. They have the perspective.
Are you talking about the Gender Equality Hub? Or
no, I'm talking about like how we can bring people together, that people like that, well, women that have, or like any identity that have like a lack of technology and sort of awareness, but they are passionate about the issue, for example.
So I think it's really just depends on, I feel like it just sounds more like an administrative issue of just you figuring out what the best way for all of you to connect is.
I'm not talking about the hub specifically. I'm talking about
I know,
like
yeah.
Further, like, for example, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I think
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but yeah.
I mean, it's something we were talking about it a bit in the chat too, is just the issues that come up as we're all moving our programming online, and the new challenges, the ones that persist, and the new challenges that come with trying to ensure accessibility and inclusion in these programs. And I think that's something a lot of us are definitely in the process of figuring out. So on that note, Michelle will definitely, if we see any resources that are helpful, like maybe this is something we can include in a new conversation that comes out of Activate Change, or send resources in our newsletter, ask our partners. So we'll just keep that in mind.
Because it's really a question about technological accessibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just trying to figure out where everybody is and what's the best way for them to connect. I think that's the main issue, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, next. We have a couple more questions if you have time for that.
I'm fine, yeah.
Okay, great. So Sarah was asking if you have any further, she works with girls and young women, and she's wondering if you have any further insight on shaping spaces for girls with these principles in mind that you discussed here today. She agrees that we need to redefine leadership and with a theoretical background around it, but she'd love to know a bit more about that on the ground and in practice.
So I think I haven't worked with girls in around like 3 years, but before then I used to run workshops and day-long camps for young women and girls who were interested in politics, and I think the age range was about like 9 to 15. So I think working with girls is completely different than working with young women, mainly because again they're at a different stage in their lives, their attention spans, their needs, their priorities are completely different than the young women we work with, which are more often than not 20 years old and above. But I really think that, again, there's a lot of amazing programming happening. I know that Girl Guides of Canada, for example, they have some digital programming online currently that, again, is not theoretical. It's not about feminism, or it's not around any big words or issues. It's really mainly about making sure that young women and girls are kind of thinking about the ideas of leadership, who leaders are, and kind of figuring out what different causes are that they may be interested about or that may be impacting their life. So I think I would say like that would be a great space to start in terms of programming for girls. But again, I think I believe that it's really it's different methods of education, right? Of understanding what the issues are that young women care about, of how young women engage with civic institutions, and how we can really be able to kind of create ways and programming for them to engage with civic institutions. I know it's a bit harder now because everything's online, but we collaborated with YWCA Toronto a while ago to take their some of the participants from their girls center to a trip up City Hall, and so they had a field trip that was really interesting. But again, I haven't worked with girls a lot, so in terms of programming, I won't be able to offer that much insight. But what the one thing I will say is that I think girls now are like much more smarter and socially aware than kind of like I was at my age, or a lot of us like millennial women were when we were the same age. So I think really having honest conversations around kind of like social justice and ideas that may be going on in their lives is I think is where I would start. And that's what we, for the last 2 times I've worked with girls and young women in the past few years, it's been a co-design process of just sitting down with the girls and figuring out what they care about, what they think is unfair, the things that they're facing on a daily basis, and kind of really build a program and a curriculum around that. But yeah, in terms of designing programming for girls, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask.
I would add that, you know, based on what you said in your presentation, I mean, this assumption that folks have around a lack of knowledge or experience that some folks have, you know, like you just said, asking the community that you want to help, that you want to serve, to shape programs for what they need, what they want. So having those conversations, bringing the girls to the table, setting up a system where you can get their feedback and incorporate it in a meaningful way as you shape your programs, I think is really important, and something that we're always trying to work on at Girls Action. And we also have a toolkit called Amplify. It's a training, and obviously we're not doing in-person trainings right now, but you can reach out and we can try to get you a electronic or hard copy, and that was created to help girls programmers design programs. Yeah, just wanted to add that a little bit. Okay, so we'll wrap it up with Maureen's questions. She kind of has, okay. Do we have time for 2 more questions?
I'm all right, yeah.
Okay, great. So Maureen has a 2.5 to 3-part question. I'll say them all and I can just remind you if you need a refresher on what the questions are. So the first one is around board of directors and how to access that body, period. So any tips for accessing that? The second question is around just your opinion on quotas for parity, again, specifically related to governance.
Yeah.
And then I'll start with that and we can come back.
So for access to board of directors, so like women accessing board of directors or sitting on boards, is that what they mean?
Any tips for us to access let's see, Maureen, if you're still on, do you want to clarify if you mean access, how you mean access? Let's see if she's still on. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just like go ahead and speak. Yeah, how to I guess how to go about it, like how it works. Is it like a process of selection? Is it like if you apply for a job, or how is that process of selection? And do you need like references, or is it more through contacts?
I would say that it is like applying for a job. Every board of directors, I think every organization based on their needs, they do have like a description for who they want to be on their board of directors, what the background, what the expertise are. It is exactly like applying for a job. There's usually, they do ask for references. There is an interview process that really tries to understand how you would fit within their own organizational structure or within the board of directors. And we know that, especially for young women, a lot of times, unfortunately, is that young women are judged based on our achievements and not our potential. And that's exactly kind of like the reverse when it comes to men. And that's how like the bias impacts young women's access to positions on boards of directors. I mean, an example of it is, whenever there's a case of like gender-based violence, for example, right? Like, or sexual violence, that the perpetrator is often, judged based on kind of their potential, right? Like, he's a great swimmer. Oh my God, he was going to be a great engineer. And that's what they're judged based on. Whereas we know that marginalized women, young women, are based on what we've achieved. So by like the age of 24, if you can prove to us that you are the best of the best and that you have worked 10 times as hard as everybody else to earn this position, then maybe we'll give you a chance. So that's where the bias comes from. So that's why a lot of organizations who've been working on kind of dismantling this whole idea that young women cannot bring kind of like diplomatic and strategic visioning to organizations. But again, yeah, it's exactly like applying. And I think a lot of it, when it comes to kind of applying for boards, a problem that a lot of folks that I work with have is that there's a lot of imposter syndrome, right? Like, we know that like men apply for a job or apply for a role when they only meet, I think, 30% of the qualifications. But women, like, we're like, oh, unless I meet 100% of those qualifications, I'm not going to apply. So it really has to do with how we view ourselves, the kind of the versions of leadership that we've been sold, and the value that we put onto our kind of achievements and our abilities. That also kind of, so it's like it's a mix of systemic and personal kind of biases that have been perpetrated to like sexism ideals of leadership. But yeah, I think, and of course, having connections is always helpful because it kind of gives you a little insight into what the organization may look for or may want. Yeah, that's what I would say. But yeah, like, I joined my first ever board of directors when I was 18, and it was because I literally emailed them and said, hey, like, you want to work with young people, but you have like no youth on your board, so like, let me be your youth chair. and then they created like a position for the youth chair, and I ran, and I got the votes, and like I got the position. So, and it may not be the same for everyone, but sometimes I think one of the things that we need to learn as racialized people and as marginal as women overall is to really bet on ourselves and our abilities, and to really take the chance, because if you apply and you get a no, it's a no, but if you don't apply, you never know what might have been. So I hope that helps. What was the second question? Was it about quotas?
Sorry, I
Yes.
muted. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I was one of the, like, I used to love quotas. I used to be a huge advocate for quotas, because again, we know like in a lot of Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden, I think it was Denmark specifically, that they introduced quotas for a few years, and by the virtue of having quotas and more women in leadership, they're like the nation's psyche and their definition of leadership had changed so much drastically to the point where once they removed the quotas, they continued to elect the same number of women. So it was kind of like a psychological test that really, I think it was really just like changing the idea of like what a leader looks like, of whether or not like women can lead. So I mean, that I was a fan of quotas, but I also feel like it can't be forced, right? Because it's very essentialist. It assumes that once we have 50-50 parliament, once we have more women in politics, all of our problems are going to be solved. And that's not necessarily true. Like, we know women who, like, there were conservative women in parliament who would like vote against like an inquiry into the MMIWG. So there are women in parliament who don't believe that women and trans folks should have autonomy over their bodies. So that's not necessarily a good thing. So I think it's really building collective power and building leadership capacity in folks that support our liberation is where I'm really focusing on. And hopefully that will transform into electoral power and votes. So I'd rather make sure that we're creating systems and structures that are supportive of like more women, more feminists getting elected, than really just trying to force as many as women as we can into these institutions that continue to uphold like oppressive systems. So that's my thoughts on quotas. Is there a third question?
There are many questions, actually. The chat is very active. So
I can't see the chat, so that's why I'm like.
Okay. So we'll keep going. And I will just say, I'll ask all the questions that are in the chat now, and I don't know if we'll make it to any additional questions, but just want to let folks know we're being conscious of the time as well. So, okay. Diversity fatigue. If you're familiar with the term, can you explain what it is?
I am actually not. So has the person, do you want to explain it? Whoever it is that asked the question.
Yeah, Maureen, do you want to unmute yourself again?
Yeah, because I went on a I went on a government's and what do you call it, board of directors workshop from the YWCA recently, like last week. And she talked about diversity fatigue, but I didn't really quite understand it. So I was wondering if you heard of it too. I guess maybe it's like something like it's become superficial or something, that like the term diversity. I'm not sure. Maybe I have to look it up.
I'm not sure I have a good understanding of the term, so I won't comment. But I mean, if you were to explain it to me, I could maybe comment on it, but I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I just want to make sure that I'm,
Yeah, we can always follow up on that also.
Yeah.
Like, yes, I'm not familiar with it.
I'm like, does it refer to like racialized people who are expected to represent all the time to be the diversity hire, or is it like a structural?
I don't know. That's why I was asking.
Yeah. It's all right.
All right. Well, we can always come back to that if, we can figure out a way to share that information with our larger community too, because I'm sure there's other folks who'd be interested in hearing more about that, learning more about that. Okay, from Charmaine. So what tips would you provide to presenting this framework to individuals who may be less socially aware or resistant to recognizing these imbalances and inequities?
I think it's really interesting because, again, the way Young Women's Leadership Network works is that a lot of the folks that we engage with are marginalized. All of our participants are Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, and of course, who are politically engaged. So we never have a problem of just, like, our baseline is our baseline. But again, I've been in like national feminist coalitions where I've had to, like, you know, they were like gender first, like women. And I was like, hey, like, this isn't working for the rest of us. So I think really starting with kind of understanding the frameworks of intersectionality and really understanding how different systems of power beyond just sexism interact to marginalize, racialized folks, people with disabilities, gender diverse folks, is where we would start. I think a lot of times, because a lot of it, this is not leadership education anymore, right? It's just like basic empathy and like basic feminism. So I think I would encourage like more conversations, because again, it's like, how do we, cause, you know, like I've had conversations with like women who've been like they're like okay with talking about like sexism and sexual violence and gender-based violence, and the moment you bring up like violence against Indigenous women, the moment you bring up like the hypersexualization of like Asian women or Black women, they shut down. So it's really like a conversation of whether or not you're the person to educate them on the issue, or whether or not they are even interested in learning more about the issue. So I think that those are two different questions. And again, if this is someone who wants to understand, I think I would say that if it's someone who is interested in understanding these struggles, they have some like self-education to do, and obviously they could pay us to educate them. But at the same time, again, we don't do anti-racism or intersectionality training, so that's not where my area of expertise lie. But
I think my question is more along, could you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. I think my question is more along the lines of, if you're noticing something, one of these things that you've talked about occurring in the organization, and you are wanting to have a conversation because maybe you're realizing that a particular individual who might be a superior or a colleague is unaware, is supposedly unaware of what is going on. How do you have that conversation in order to create that collective power and allow individuals to use their power for the better and their privilege for the better?
Yeah, because I think what we're really talking about is kind of an understanding of what the deep structures of the organization, to like understand if, I think the number one thing is to really try to understand if it is an issue that the organization has been dealing with for a while and no one's addressed it, or if it's a new issue that has to do with a specific person that now has to be addressed on like a team level. Because if it's like a deep structure issue, then like we need to talk about the organization, where the most basic values lie, and the type of leadership or the type of agenda that the organization is moving forward. But when it becomes like a more interpersonal and like direct like issue that's like directed to an individual, I think we have worked with like folks sometimes within the public service or within social justice movements to kind of build solidarity between like a bunch of other co-workers or external players to introduce different forms of kind of like education or conversations. I mean, when I say education, I don't necessarily mean like a sit down, a PowerPoint of like what all of these issues are. It can be something like a mediated conversation. It can be like an event that everyone participates in. And again, based on the severity of the problem or the issue, and like the size of the organization, sometimes working with HR to make sure that the issue is being addressed in like a meaningful and transformative way is also what I've seen happen. but again, it's again, I'm not aware of like the dynamics and the interpersonal dynamics in the organization, and sometimes it's been as simple as me just asking someone who's closer to them, to the organization, to kind of have a sit down and a conversation, and that's kind of led to like a series of trainings or different kind of conversations. But there are so many different ways to go about it, but kind of understanding whether it is a structural and an organizational issue or whether it's like an individual issue can really help you in terms of understanding what your next steps are. In terms
I think
of
those are really good points. I think they're really great distinctions. I think I was more so looking at if it's like an interpersonal level. This is not to say that it's actually happening. But I'm thinking, you know, if it were like an interpersonal level, it seems as though one of the things that you're suggesting is to either bring in someone who's closer to the individual to have that discussion, or to consult with HR. But you probably would not necessarily advise someone advise the person who is being victimized, for lack of a better word, to sort of share their distress points with the victimizer or the individual.
I mean, it really just, it really depends, right, on the situation, on what's happening. Of course, like my main, again, it's different for everyone, but I would just encourage everyone to make sure if you're experiencing something like that, like your safety should come first. It's not your responsibility to like educate that person or to engage with them on the issue. But of course, if the person who's experiencing the violence wants to be a part of that process of accountability, of course they can be. But again, I think there needs to be, and again, it is something that we're encouraging, like even nonprofits or like social, because within organizations, of course there are HR rules and there are different ways of accountability, but we're even working with marginalized women who have different initiatives or with social justice movements to make sure that they're creating guidelines for addressing situations like this, so that there are there's no confusion. But again, it really depends on the person and the violence and how they decide to move forward with it.
I see. Thank you so much for your time and support with this question. You've been really amazing.
Oh, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine. Okay, so I'll do 2 more questions. The first, okay, from Layla. She's always valued collaboration, skill sharing, community, and has wanted to create an organization or community with those values in mind. But she doesn't necessarily feel like she has the skills required for people to partake in it. So how should she go about, any recommendations for how she should go about building those skills, or groups that she could be a part of, things like that?
Yeah, I would say please get in touch with me, because I do work with a lot of grassroots initiatives and especially like feminist groups serving young women and girls to make sure that we're building capacity, especially for advocacy, but also for resource development and marketing, which is often very helpful in terms of reaching supporters and reaching folks to kind of participate in your programming. So that is something that at Young Women's Leadership Network we do. We believe that as an organization who has somewhat of a presence and stability, we need to be lending our resources and our knowledge to organizations and to groups who want to support their communities. So please do that. But I mean, when I started this, I was 22. I literally just saw a grant application. I applied for it and we got the grant. And then I literally had a day with my co-founder and we sat down and we were like, okay, so what are we doing? So it wasn't like I didn't have an agenda for like how this organization was going to look like. We weren't incorporated as a nonprofit until 2 years later. It was really us knowing, kind of again, like exactly like you, we know where our values are, we know where the gaps are, and we know what we need in order to address them. So it was really about finding a co-founder for me who was dedicated to the issue, who would kind of take some weight off my shoulders and who would kind of like work with me to kind of figure out what it is that we want to do. So I would say that like you probably have more capacity and more skills that you're giving yourself credit for. That's number one. But number two, I'm always open to providing any support. And of course, Girls Action, they've always been very, very active and supportive, either when it comes to advice, or sometimes they used to have micro grants. They've been very supportive of building feminist movements and initiatives as well. But I would say you do that. And I think another one that's more technical is just search some of the organizations that do similar work to what it is that you do. It's going to help you kind of find programming and ideas that are going to be helpful in developing your own work, but to also see where the gaps are in terms of what's offered and what's not offered, and what needs to be on the table.
Great, thank you. She will definitely get in contact, she says in the chat. Awesome. Okay, so just to wrap it up, kind of a combination of a couple of comments and questions, but any podcasts, books, resources, even organizations that are in this similar space to continue the conversations, the discussions, and just the learning around this topic today?
So this is hella biased, but I'm going to say it. You should listen to the Bad and Bitchy podcast because I'm one of the hosts. I haven't been on any of the podcasts yet, just because I was brought on last week, but I've been listening to them for 2 years. They're a feminist podcast that analyzes Canadian politics and culture through an intersectional lens. It's been very interesting, and I'm really excited to be joining the team. But as an organization, I would say Future Ancestors, founded by Larissa Crawford, they do amazing work when it comes to anti-oppression and climate justice. So they follow them on Instagram. They do a lot of they post a lot of amazing information in terms of a lot of anti-oppressive practices and notions that we should all be aware of. Larissa, follow Larissa, she's amazing as well. Another organization, I think Leading in Color, I think they were on this series last night.
Yes.
They're really great. Also Assembly of Seven Generations in Ottawa, they're an Indigenous youth-led community group that is focused on serving Indigenous youth locally, but again, they do such amazing work. I would actually encourage you folks to donate to them as well if you can. And in terms of podcasts, Bitch Media has a podcast that I really like. I don't know the name, but it's really great. Yeah, but those are the two.
Perfect. I would add The Collectress, and I'm from the US, so maybe whatever, I'll share them anyway without the caveat. And then Rachel Cargill, who's on Instagram, and she has an incredible training series around unpacking white feminism, and just a lot of resources that I find incredibly helpful. And then Hood Feminism is a new-ish book by Mickey Kendall that I would highly, highly recommend. Also Nor Montreal. I'm reading some comments are coming through with additional resources. So what I can do is a couple of things as we wrap up. I know folks are really interested in continuing some of these conversations around, we had talked about a lot today. So potentially having a follow-up conversation series around some of the topics that were brought up today, or maybe kind of more discussion or chat type of based events as well. I will put together some of the resources that we talked about, as well as the recordings of these workshops and the slides into some kind of e-newsletter format. So please be patient as we put that together. We're hoping to also translate these presentations and add subtitles. So we will share the resources as soon as we can. Thank you so much, Arezoo, for being here, for co-creating and holding this space with us. It was such an engaging, helpful, informative, etc. presentation, and so important, especially in the face of what's happening now, and continuing to move forward. And great, I'm rambling now, but yeah, thank you so much.
No, of course.
So I just want to let everyone know, we do have a space where you can send us your feedback. I'll just share my screen really quick. So there is a survey. If you are signed up for the event tomorrow, then we just ask that you wait until the very end, the last event, to fill out the survey. Otherwise, you can just fill out, if you only participated in today's or yesterday's and today's, you can fill it out now. And we're looking to co-create with you all. So if you have ideas for workshops, topics, suggestions, comments, please feel free to email me. The events at email, I'll be the one to respond to you. So I think that's it. If there is nothing else. Yeah. Anything in the chat? Just double checking. No. All right, great. So thank you, everyone. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so
your
much.
time and participation.
No, I'm like, seriously, it's been, I think 4 months since I've been to like a feminist event or gathering. So I'm just like, can we like keep this going until 9? Because I'm I'm having like feminist withdrawals. Like, yeah,
this is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for this space.
Of course, thank you for being here and again holding the space with us. I know you can't see the chat, but folks really enjoyed your presentation, and so hopefully we can continue this conversation in another forum or online somewhere. So we'll be in touch, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.